If you want to start a heated debate amongst Corvette fans, just ask them which Corvette is the greatest one of all time. And trust me, there'll be no shortage of people choosing this one or that one. But I think an awful lot of Corvette fans are going to choose this car right here, a 1967 Corvette. I mean, I know the 1963 gets a lot of the discussion because of that 1-year split window in the back, but this 1967 is the ultimate evolution of that second generation C2 Corvette. A great looking car that delivers on just about every level. Hi there, Rick DeBrule here again at the Martin Auto Museum, a great collection of more than 170 cars, including a wonderful Corvette room. We have 12 Corvettes here, spanning the full spectrum, from C1 all the way up to the mid-engine C8. Now, let's start by talking about the Corvettes and explaining what we mean by the C1, C2, all the way up to C8. Those are simply the Corvette generations. The first generation, of course, the C1. This is the C2. That C1 was the beginning of the Corvette line, going back to 1953 when it first hit the streets and didn't sell an awful lot back in those days. In fact, a lot of people would have been surprised to even find out that it was still around so many decades later. The C2, well, that began in 1963 and went to 1967, this car right here, the end of the line. And going back to sales numbers, what's interesting is the 1966 C2 Stingray Corvette, well, they sold 27,000 of those. Now, I told you that this one, in many ways, is the ultimate evolution, and many people would consider this the best Corvette of all times. But its sales numbers don't reflect that. Back in 1967, they only sold 22,000 of these. Why? Well, because in 1968, they were going to come up with a completely restyled Corvette, and an awful lot of people said, well, why would I want to buy that old-looking Corvette when I can buy the new, cooler-looking Corvette? Little did they realize, once again, decades later, that this 1967 C2 Corvette would be one of the most desirable body styles, one of the most desired years of all time when it came to the Corvette. Why? Well, look at it. I mean, it just delivers on pretty much every level. We'll dive into the styling in just a moment. But it's a car that really went off in a new direction. And underneath the hood, well, by the time it got to 1967, they had evolved to the point that they had bigger engines, more horsepower, they had more comfort inside. This car, once again, was the ultimate evolution of what those mid-year C2 Corvettes could be. Let's start by talking about the styling of this C2 Corvette. This is the 1967, but as I mentioned, this body style came out in 1963. And really, before we talk about this car, we have to talk about the other significant sports cars of the day, because you need to understand that when this car, this look came out in 1963, it was radically different than all of the other significant sports cars. Why is that? Well, if you look at the Ferraris, if you look at the Jaguars, what's completely different about them is that they're rounded in shape. Whereas this car, this Corvette, the C2, is very angular. Look at the sharp edge at the nose. Look at the sharp creases coming up on the fenders. This was completely different than all of the other significant sports cars of its day. Now, there were other sports cars that would follow this styling in later years, but in 1963, this car was very unique. So where did the styling come from? Well, there are a couple concepts from the 1950s that really played into the design for this car. One was called the Q concept. On paper, if you look at it from the side, boy, it looks an awful lot like what the mid-year 1963 to 67 Corvette was going to become. Then there was the Stingray Racer of 1959, Bill Mitchell's Stingray Racer, which had this very similar look, although without the coupe top. Now, this back end, some people call it the ducktail, this actually appeared in 1961, a couple years before the Stingray look happened. So we had a couple years of a preview of that, but this front end, the sharp end on this, well, this was very different than anything that had come before it. Also very significant, it was underneath here, you've got headlights that hide away. And this was the first time Detroit had produced hideaway headlights since the DeSoto back in 1942. This was originally produced to be a coupe, and then the convertible was added after the fact. Now, we also talked about the fact that the 1963 is what we call the split window, meaning that in the back, it actually has a bar running down the center. And that was a very controversial styling model within the Chevrolet world. Ultimately, they decided that was not the best thing they could do for visibility, and so it went away. A lot of people love those 1963 split windows, but when you think about it, this is ultimately what you want. You want to be able to see out the back of that car because, well, you want to wave at all the people as you're driving past them on the road. Another thing that makes the 1967 Corvette so spectacular are the engine options. Let's go back to 1963. Everything was a 327 in that first year of the Stingray. Now, there were different variations of horsepower. You could start at 250 horsepower and work your way all the way up to a 360 horsepower fuel-injected engine. Now, by 1967, the fuel injection had gone away. Now, the 327 was still around, but now you had three different engine blocks available. You had the 327, you had the 396 cubic inch engine option, or you had the 427 cubic inch big block available. And those, of course, were bringing big horsepower when you were in the 427 versions. And the ultimate engine that was available was something referred to as the L88. Now, L88 simply referred to the what's called RPO, the designation for that particular option in the Corvette package. But the L88 engine, it delivered officially 435 horsepower. Now, what was interesting was the next one down delivered 430 horsepower. And you paid more than $1,000 extra to get the L88 engine. So why was it worth it for just 5 horsepower? Well, it's because it wasn't 5 horsepower. Some estimates have shown that that engine was probably capable of 560 horsepower. Now, once again, it was expensive, especially when you considered a Corvette was only costing around $4,000. That was a big chunk if you were going to spend extra. As a result, only 20 people bought them that first year they were available in 1967. And not surprisingly, those are very rare and very valuable today. So if you can get your hands on an L88, well, it's a solid investment, and it's really a blue chip engine. But the great thing about the 67 Corvette was, even with the 327 cubic inch engine option, you still got 300 horsepower. You still had plenty of power to go wherever you wanted to go. The 327 actually a little bit lighter up front, better handling in some ways. But I go back to the point, why is the 67 the ultimate evolution? Not just because of the beauty of the look and the fact that it doesn't have that goofy thing going down the back with a split window. It has all of these engine options that give you so many choices of what you want to do. In 1967, if you wanted to buy a 2-seat mass-produced American sports car, this was it, the Corvette. You got to remember, you know, a decade earlier when the Thunderbird had come out, well, that was a 2-seater, but the Baby Bird went away. It only had 2 seats between 55, 56, and 57. In 1958, it went to becoming a 4-seat car. There were some other cars, Kaiser Darren, that had tried, but this, in 1967, was the only 2-seat mass-produced American sports car you could buy. There were plenty of options if you wanted foreign cars, and MGBs, you know, Jaguars, all kinds of stuff. But for an American car, this was it. The way this interior was designed is perfectly done to be a personal driving experience. The reality is they didn't care about the passenger. This wasn't about the passenger. This was about the driver. And similar to the way a Corvette is laid out today, it's really designed to encompass you. All the gauges, all these nice round gauges are all laid out. You got a tachometer, you got a speedometer. Everything is just exactly where you need it if you're going to go, well, performance driving. Unfortunately, back in the mid-60s, this car, while it was a great race car, it had to face the Cobras of its day. So it wasn't winning on the track as much as it could from 1963 on, but still it was a great performance car. One other interesting styling touch that I like about this car that they've done is they have this vertical stack right in the center, and I really love what they've done with the radio, where they've mounted it vertically with those buttons where you can see the numbers up and down. It's an interesting way and a creative way of taking the space they've got and using it effectively. And as I said, this was really an experience for the driver, not so much for the passenger. In fact, in earlier versions, they had a grab bar for the passenger. By 1967, well, that grab bar was gone. The passenger was on its own. But in terms of a driving experience, getting in the car and feeling great about it, I love the way they've designed this because it works so well, it feels like just a personal sports car, which is exactly what it's supposed to be. To give you a little extra insight into how that 67 Corvette operates, there's something cool here at the Martin Auto Museum. This is a 1967 Corvette convertible. that has been converted into a display car where they have lifted the body off so you can see all of the mechanical underpinnings underneath. You can see the engine, the chassis, everything. And as you can see, it is a very traditional layout. Front engine, got the transmission in the center right there. It's got a drive shaft going back to the differential. Now, what's cool about the Corvette is it has independent suspension front and rear. You see those axles going off at their own separate angles so that each wheel can go up and down and bounce on its own. Traditional A-arm setup up front. Check that out. Look how they've actually cut away so you can see the valves inside as they would be going up and down, the rockers up above, and the carburetor. Everything underneath this has been taken apart so you can see. Now, one thing we should point out, between the 1962 and the 1963 Corvette, when they went from the C1 to the C2, they actually shortened the wheelbase of this car by about 4 inches. Now, the overall length only shrank by a couple of inches, but they wanted this car to be a little more nimble on the road, so they cut it down by just about 4 inches in terms of the overall wheelbase. Now, here's the gas tank in the back. One of the cool things for racing is you actually could get a big tank, a much, much larger tank, and it was really used for racing so that you could go long distance racing and not have to refuel as many times. But they used it as a factory option because back in those days, things had to be what are called homologated. You had to be able to buy it by a normal option from a dealer so that it could be eligible for racing. But it's a pretty cool thing they've done here, and it gives you a true example as to what this Corvette looks like underneath. Let's take a moment to talk about how everything evolved from 1967, the end of the C2, to the beginning of the C3 generation. Just happen to have one right next to it here at the Martin Auto Museum. This is a 1968 Corvette. They refer to this as the Mako Shark body style because it's designed to look like the Mako Shark 2. But you can see how, yeah, it still has some of the sharp lines, but now it's going into some of a more rounded direction. And look at how that front nose points out compared to the 1967, which was straight all across. Yeah, it still used those hideaway headlamps and everything, but from a styling perspective, it's really interesting to look at how they came from this very angular, very sharp car to a more flowing look, which still had some sharp lines to it. One of the cool styling touches, if you bought the big block 427 cubic inch engine, was you also got the Stinger hood. Remember, this is a Stingray, and this was the Stinger that told everybody that if they were going to try to race you at the light, they were going to get stung. So let's go back to our debate. Why is the 1967 Corvette a strong contender to be the greatest Corvette of all time? Well, let's talk about performance. I mean, I talked about the fact that in this 427 cubic inch engine, you had a lot of horsepower. And if you bought that L88, you could get 560 available horses. That was unheard of back in 1967. Yes, are there Corvettes that came along later that have more horsepower? Absolutely. But for its day, this was a beast if you got the L88, and if you only got the 327, you still had 300 horsepower. A lot of power back in those days. From a suspension perspective, it was an upgrade over everything. Once again, not as sleek and smooth as you get today, but you still had four-wheel disc brakes. Remember, they hadn't come along in 1963. They didn't appear until 65. So for 67, you could get four-wheel disc brakes. And then, of course, there was a styling. This was completely new in its day. Nothing looked like this. European styling actually began to follow some of the sharp angular lines that this Corvette produced. So it had performance, it had looks, it had drivability. It's just a great experience in every level. Are there other Corvettes that could make a good run? Yeah, there's some pretty cool Corvettes out there. But the 1967 Corvette is my pick for the greatest Corvette of all time.